Sharing my screen now. I'm going to minimize this and flip the lecture. Hello to whoever just joined us. Nice to have you here. All right. So let's talk about value. And value, as you probably already know, is just simply the term we use for light and dark. And it's important in terms of determining like the figure and the ground. So the relationships between light and dark help us figure out when we're looking at a piece of art or any kind of design, what is the figure and what is the ground. When the light is reduced, like dusk, we become even more dependent on value than color. So during the daytime, we're noticing color and we're seeing the contrast between color. But as the light fades, we become very dependent on how much contrast there is, which is why during a moonlit night, you find it easier to take a little walk than during a overcast or a small moon where there's not a lot of light coming from the sky. It's very difficult to figure out which is the ground and which is the path and which is the sky. Here we have a value scale of gray, and let's see, you can't see that bottom of there, but this is a value scale, and there's a longer version in your book. And it just shows you just a few mixtures of black and white to make various shades of gray. The middle circle is the same middle gray in all the examples, but you can see that it changes as the gray behind it changes. This is a achromatic gray scale, and we can see about 40 levels of value. Most humans can see about 40 levels. In your histogram in Photoshop, you have 256 stops between black and white. So there are 256 shades of gray in Photoshop, and that's what the histogram is actually measuring. So the scale here is sequential, and the contrast between each square is kind of minimal. But the contrast between the lightest lights and the darkest darks is pretty profound and creates a really sharp image that kind of pops off the screen. When you have areas of dark and light, the term that designers or artists use is called value contrast, and that's referring to the relationship between those areas of dark and light. And as I mentioned, most humans can see about 40 different variations in value. And then low value contrast is the term that describes the difference between any two areas that next to each other that have slight differences in contrast. This photograph that we're looking at here has a wide range of values between dark and light, and this is a really great example of how great photographers don't just take pictures, they compose them. So the range here of light to dark is only apparent when you have the correct lighting, when you have the correct exposure, you're using the right kind of film. So you don't just walk into a place and snap your camera and get this kind of photograph. You have to create it, and that's why photographers are who they are. They look at all of these things when they're composing their photographs. you can use value to create balance in a picture, and you can use it to create emphasis. So in this etching here, the light is really concentrated over by the window, and there's a lot of light on that very small group of family figures. And then as you move away from the family and the window, there's little hints of light picking up edges of things and giving you a sense that there is something else in the room. But it really quickly fades to sort of a neutral gray on the left and very dark on the right. So when you look at this, you can see how the artist just using, it's actually an etching, so they just used a sharp instrument or pen to create these cross-hatched lines to make this entire range of dark to lights. Value and color are very closely related. Every color has a certain value. Pure yellow is what they call a high value or a light color, and it corresponds to a really light gray in terms of light reflection. And then purple is a dark, low value color that would match like a really dark gray. Pure red would fall somewhere in the middle. When you look at this painting by Henri Matisse, on the left, all the color's been taken out, and if you just kind of cover up the one on the right and look at the one at the left, you would at first think that this painting is very unbalanced. It has a lot of middle gray over on the left side and down at the bottom, and just a small little area of light in the upper right with maybe a band, running down kind of the center right. But then once you add color, you can see how color takes an unbalanced grayscale drawing and balances it out. So you have high contrast with the pink and the green, which actually tend to be kind of complementary colors. And then you have the really light object in the upper right. And again, another little area of contrast between the orange and the blue, stripes running down, and the orange figure in the bottom left. So you can take something that seems unbalanced and balance it by adding some little pops of color. And there's some other examples in your book. Variations in dark and light are called the value pattern. And this is again, a black and white version of Artemisia Gentileschi's painting of Judith beheading Holofernes, which is a gruesome story and a pretty gruesome painting. But here it's been reduced to just lights and darks, and you can see how the artist used high contrast, really dark darks and really light lights to form these diagonal lines and these areas of really heightened contrast. And there's a lot going on here. It's a very dramatic scene, and the way the artist has created the lights and darks reflects that. You can use light, or you can use value to create a focal point. And in this painting by Homer Winslow, you can see the areas of contrast. So the underbelly of the trout contrasts against the dark background, and then the darker tail contrasts against the lighter reflection of the light from the water. So this helps that trout just kind of pop off the screen. Sometimes artists will use value and contrast just to create pieces of visual art that don't really carry a message, but are just statements about light and dark. Andy Goldsworthy is an artist who works in natural materials. And here he's taken the same stick on 2 consecutive days. In the photograph on the left, there was a fresh snowfall, and the stick, the branch, is very dark against the light snow. The next day, he went back, the bark was stripped off and stripped, chewed, and scraped off, and the snow had melted, leaving a dark leaf base. So just experiment in value, no hidden agenda or meaning or anything like that, but just a way to create art in a really interesting and high contrast way, almost like a negative of each other. We use value to create volume or space. And if you've taken a drawing or a painting class, no doubt you've done this yourself. This example here is a watercolor and pencil drawing or painting that really beautifully gives you a sense of depth and three-dimensionality and space. And that's one of the things that we use value for quite a bit in all of art. Chiaroscuro is a Renaissance term that describes the artistic device that uses light and dark to imply depth and volume. And we see that in this example. You can use value to create depth in a painting or in a composition. So as you're putting together your projects this week, you may think about using value. And the way we do that in Photoshop is to manipulate the layers. We can add effects to certain layers, or we can reduce the opacity of certain layers, and you can kind of create this idea of atmospheric perspective. So anything with high contrast is going to appear to come forward in the picture, and anything with low contrast will appear to recede. You can create certain psychological tension and as well as physical space in a piece by using different levels of value. So you can create zones of lightness and dark. And this is an example of Suko. She did this etching of Charlie Parker, who struggled with addiction in his life, and she made a statement about his life, his addiction, his struggle in this piece of hers. And she used light and dark in a couple of different ways. She divided up the painting really into a more light area, which is focused on Charlie Parker, and then a darker area, which is more focused on the Black gentleman and the fact that there's a syringe in Charlie Parker's hand. So you can use value to kind of create a mood as well. When you use shading, there's lots of different types of shading. You can even, we use gradients and things like that in Photoshop, but you can also use some of these other techniques. You could apply a pattern to a certain selection and start to get something that's very similar to cross-hatching or pointillism. But shading is the use of value in a work of art, and as we can see here, it does create a lot of visual interest and a lot of depth. Sometimes it depends on the medium that you're using. So just some of the ways that people who are working with pen and paper might use value or change value in a piece would be using cross-hatching, using a wash drawing where darker inks or watercolor are progressively thinned out with water to get lighter and lighter shades, and then mixed media. You can also use pointillism or dots. We see dots all the time used to convey value. We see them in newspaper, we see them in magazines, and we see them in books. And then sometimes, like in this example, it's used in design on purpose. So this is a fashion, a catalog spread, and the artist or the photographer has used almost pointillism to give areas of light and dark in this fashion artistic statement. So all the ways that you can use value, and the value is really, really closely related to color, which we're going to take a look at next. You can spend entire, I don't know, semesters or years working on understanding color. It's fascinating. There's a lot of great websites online that talk about color and offer tutorials on color. So we're just going to skim through this, and I know that it's not the last that you'll see about color in your career. So we all make decisions every day about color, what to wear, what to paint our walls, what color flowers to select from the market. And everyone profits from learning a little bit about color theory. So the essentials of color is that it's a property of light. And I'm sure that when you were younger, you heard about Sir Isaac Newton, who put white light through a prism and was able to see colors, the spectrum of colors. So objects don't have any color of their own. They depend on light. They reflect a particular wavelength from the color spectrum. So the way it works in real life is the light comes down, it hits an object reflects everything except, say, or absorbs everything except, say, a blue wavelength. And so the blue wavelength gets reflected back and our eyes interpret it as blue. So black absorbs everything, nothing is reflected back, and white reflects everything, nothing is absorbed. There's two systems that we use in the art and design world. There's the additive system, where the color is created from a projected light. That would be things like theater lighting, photography, and all the primary colors mix to create white in an additive system. In a subtractive system, which is what you experience if you're a painter or you're using colored pencils or something like that, the color is created from pigments, and when you mix all the primary colors together, you get a neutral gray or a black. We use the color wheel most often for organizing color, and the primary colors in a subtractive color wheel are red, blue, and yellow. We'll see a color wheel a little bit later here. So color is a product of light, and light changes how you see color. You see this in your own home. Colors, you paint your walls a certain color, and during the course of the day, that paint color changes depending on the light. You know, the early morning light is a lot different from the evening light, which is a lot different from the midday light. So colors change throughout the day. We think of things as having a set color. And the example here is that grass is green. But if you think about it, sometimes the grass is gray like early in the morning. Sometimes it may have hints of blue or brown. Sometimes it may have a bluish tint or a yellowish tint, but we tend to just say grass is green, sky is blue, trees are, leaves are green. But just be aware that light and color are tied together. Color also changes depending on what is around it. And most of the time we're looking at colors that are surrounded by other colors. So our perception of that color is altered by the other colors that are interacting with it. In this example, we have a neutral gray, but it looks very different when the green is behind it as compared to when the pink is behind it. There was an artist, Joseph Albers, who devoted his whole career to the study of color and color relationships. So lots of times when you see these examples, these sort of visual, you almost can think of them as games or puzzles, but those are things that Albers developed when he was studying color. There are three main properties of color. There's hue, there's value, and then there's intensity. So the hue is the name of the color. The red, orange, green, purple, those are all hues. And hue and color are often used as synonyms, but there's a distinction. So hue describes the visual sensation of the different part of the color spectrum. One hue can be varied to produce many colors. So there are relatively few hues, but there's almost an unlimited number of colors. And all you have to do to really understand this is walk into Home Depot and take a look at the paint swatches. So you can see almost a limitless variety of blue. There's an incredible array in color names, and sometimes it's actually hard to get past the names and to the real color that you're looking for. So be aware that there are people, I would love to have this job actually, that just think up color names, and their job is to make them sound really appealing to you. And if you actually try not to look at those color names, you might get a little more close to what you are looking for without being affected by the color name. We use a color wheel for organizing the colors and for, excuse me, determining color schemes. So this dates back to the 18th century, and it's made up of subtractive colors, primary colors of which are red, yellow, and blue. Secondary colors are mixtures of the primary colors. So where you have yellow and red, the color that's in between, that's mixed with equal amounts of yellow and red, gives you orange. In theory, if you are an artist, especially watercolor, say, you have no doubt mixed yellow and red together and gotten not an orange that you want, but something that is pretty far from what you want. So within the hues, of course, there's a lot of variation. I mean, within the colors. So within the hues, there's a lot of colors, and within the colors, when you mix them together, there's a lot of variation. So just keep in mind that this is theory. Tertiary colors are mixtures of a primary and a secondary color. So if you take orange and you take red, you get a red-orange or an orange-red, and that gives you the tertiary color. Some of the properties of color are value. So value is the lightness or darkness of the hue. If you add white to a hue, you get a higher value color or a tint. And if you add black to a hue, you get a lower value color or a shade. And normal color values differ. just keep those things in mind. When you're working with paint, you can thin a color. When you're working with Photoshop, you can reduce the opacity. You can, there's almost an infinite variety of colors on our color spectrum in Photoshop. So you can move your color closer to the white, the light spectrum or the dark spectrum and alter the value. And you can alter things that you put next to color, and that will change the value. So here's an example of how colors change with their context. Here we have green in both of these examples, but it looks a lot different when it's woven through black than when it's woven through white. Intensity refers to the brightness of a color, and a color is full intensity when it's pure or unmixed. It is also referred to as the chroma or the saturation. And the way you can lower the intensity of a color is to mix it with gray or mix it with the complement. And the complement is the color that is across on the opposite side of the color wheel, and that will neutralize it. So if you want to make things brighter, you want to use contrast. When two complements are placed next to each other, think of red and green, think of blue and orange. They increase in visual brilliance, and you get sort of a vibrating edge almost. If you stare at an intense color for a minute or so, and then you look away, your retina experiences fatigue from absorbing that color, and you'll actually, if you look away and you look at, say, a neutral colored wall, you'll see the complementary color. And that's just something that happens in your receptors, your retina, in your receptors. So when we're using Photoshop, we're mixing light. And there's a number of different ways that you can use the color picker. I'm sure you've all experimented just a little bit. But you should know that you can either move your mouse around and choose colors by choosing something that looks right to you, or you can use one of the color systems and put in the value down there on the lower right. So there's the HSB, which is the hue, saturation, and brilliance, I believe. And we don't use that color mode very often. By default, we're in the RGB mode, and you can actually put in different amounts of red, green, and blue to get a specific color. The number right below the RGB is a web number that, and I forget the proper name for it, but you can sample these colors from the web and put that number in. It's a combination of numbers and letters, and you'll get the exact shade or hue that across the spectrum at any computer. Then there's lab color, which again we don't use very much, but for printing we do use CMYK. So cyan, magenta, yellow, and K is black. And again, just like RGB or any of those, you can actually input those values and get a specific CMY color. This becomes a lot more important if you're printing professionally, and you'll spend more time learning about that if you're going in that direction, but just so you're aware. You can do visual color mixing. Sometimes if you actually try to mix colors this is more in 2D, so if you're painting or drawing, you don't get as vivid a result as you would like. So artists have used other techniques. They've tried optical mixing, where they put pure colors side by side. This is Chuck Close, and he is very famous for doing this. So it's almost like pointillism again. You put two pure colors very close, and then when we are viewing this, we see the colors mixed. So at a certain distance, you know, if you got really close, you would just see these as individual areas of color, but the farther you get away, the more they blend together. And that's called visual mixing or optical mixing. And you can do that with using Photoshop very easily. They also use it in textiles. TVs use it. So if you get really close to your TV, I'm not so sure about the newer TVs with the retina displays and the newer computers, but pixels on a computer are, as we know from looking at resolution, often have areas of pure color right next to each other. And then color printing uses the 4-color dot system, CMYK. Color also has physical and emotional sensations or meanings. So there are cool colors and there are warm colors. The cool colors tend to be the blues, the greens, and the violets. And in general, cool colors recede. The warm colors tend to come forward in a picture, and those are the reds, the oranges, and the yellows. You could use color to create a psychological feel. Warm colors are going to suggest a feeling of heat, and cool colors might induce a chill. So here we have an architect who is using warm colors, yellow on the wall, and blue colors, the blue tile, to create a kitchen that has a lot of visual interest. They're almost actually complementary colors as well, and is sort of playing with the warm and the cool idea. So you might think about your own kitchen, your own rooms. You know, do you tend to use cool colors, warm colors? Is there a room that really isn't working in your house? And is that because of the basic color that you've chosen on the walls and on the ceiling or in the decor? So these things are important when you're designing also. It's a little disconcerting but you can use it to your advantage. So if you created let's say a beach landscape with a lot of horizontal lines, but the colors that you chose are very warm, very intense, you might get the viewer might get the feeling that something isn't quite right, something, it's not the blue and the grays and the tans that they expect. So it can be used to sort of raise your alarms a little, or just let you know that something isn't quite as it seems. Here we have an example of cool colors and how they can create a sense of depth in this landscape picture. So the blues are getting cooler and cooler as they go towards the upper part of this painting, and that gives us a feeling of depth and distance. You use color as emphasis. So here we have just abstract shapes, but we have, one element that's a different color, and so it creates a focal point in each of these, and also a sense of movement in each of these 3 examples here. This is Andy Goldsworthy again, and this is really interesting. You might think that he painted this yellow circle on these leaves, but in reality, he took yellow leaves and carefully tore them and matched them up to the dark leaves, and then created this circular shape on a bed of darker leaves. And then, as we started out saying, you can achieve balance with color. So on the left, you see the painting on the right reduced to just black and white, and it looks unbalanced. It looks really heavily weighted to the left. But on the right, with the addition of that red dot, it really adds a lot of emphasis to that upper right area and tends to balance out everything that's happening on the left. And here's another example of how color, and these are, this artist is using complementary colors and analogous colors to create this kind of playful. And if you are using a MindTap, there is a series of videos with this artist where she talks about how she sets these compositions up using really ordinary things like Kleenex boxes and boxes that she's wrapped in different colors, like the orange box, and just creates these shapes that she then paints. And we talked about this a lot. Color can create depth. You use color, intense warm colors that come forward. So in here we see some reds and golds. They're coming forward, and then the cool colors back there in the background tend to convey atmospheric perspective. You can also use color if you want to emphasize flatness. So here in this painting, the artist has used color equally. It hasn't changed it to a shade or a tone. They've just used color as it comes out of the paint and created these big areas of flat shapes. Color schemes are just combinations of particular colors. There's an example here of monochromatic. So this is just using one hue in an image, and you can change the value a lot, and you can use it usually with black and white. So we see some almost pure white here, some very, very dark blues that almost look black, and create a kind of a dramatic effect. The 5 basic color schemes are analogous, where you use two or more hues that sit next to each other on a color wheel. So until you really learn your color wheel, it might be helpful just to keep one handy. You can use colors that are complements, so they're opposite each other. You see these all the time in like restaurant design. You can use split complements. So you take a complement like red and green, and instead of using the red, you'll use the red orange and the red violet, and use those colors together. It's a little less poppy than just strictly complementary. Triadic uses 3 hues equally distanced on the color wheel. So red, blue, and yellow would be one triadic. And then monochromatic uses the one plus shades and tints. In the Vermeer painting on the left, that's a triadic. So there's red, blue, and yellow all used in this painting. And then on the right, there's analogous. So red and orange are the main colors, and then the artist has incorporated some red, orange, and orange, yellow in a way that are all next to each other with little pops, as you can see, of kind of a greenish color, which is a contrasting color to red. So when you're planning a color scheme, most of the time, if you are designing for an advertisement or something like that, you get to be really deliberate with your color schemes based on the message that you're delivering. And then if you're painting or you're creating something that's more photorealistic, let's say, then you might stick to colors that are more intuitive, that you know will read the way you want them as the object that you want the viewer to see them as or interpret them as. And knowing these harmonies help all artists and designers consciously plan the visual effects that they want a finished work to have. If you want to create a little bit of discord, or a little bit of activity, you can use unexpected combinations. So there's no one color scheme going on in this WolfCon painting. Instead, there's just a lot of contrast, and there's a lot of warm colors with just areas of cool that give just a really lively, vibrating look to it. So color discord is also a thing, and it's the opposite of color harmony. So it creates a little bit of visual disturbance. They don't balance each other, and it may create a composition that's really exciting or stimulating. It can be eye-catching. The fashion world uses this, so we're kind of used to seeing it. And you might think of a visual surprise if you're thinking about using colors that don't adhere to a specific color scheme. And it often seems more modern because we are less tied to color theory these days, and a lot of artists and designers are seeking unexpected and unusual color combinations. So if you're looking to create something really modern, you may not go with those traditional color schemes. When you have colors in high conflict, these are complementary colors placed very close together. It's almost difficult to look at. It's really hard to read, and our eye becomes fatigued. It does create a sense of vibration or flickering, so you can use this to your advantage when you're designing something like a poster like this. And then there's other ways to use color. Local color or objective color is the color that an object seems to have under ordinary daylight. You can create optical color, so you can create color that gives you the sense of a time of day. So if you're creating a composition and you want to create a sense that it's evening, you may go towards the cooler colors and have white that has a tinge of blue in it. And then subjective color is the arbitrary use of color. So here you would pick colors just based on the design or your own aesthetics or an emotional response that you are looking to create. Here's an example of heavy use of blues to create an emotional response in the viewer. So generally, the warm colors, you get happy and cheerful reactions. The cool colors, you get more melancholy or depressing reactions. And an artist will often use color to add emotional impact to an already volatile or emotive work. So here, the artist has a very sort of a tense scene, and the artist has chosen to use a complementary color scheme to heighten that sense of tension. Then you can think about conceptual qualities of color. So think about all the ways that we describe emotions or personality traits with color. And always, if you're designing for the public, you'll need to keep in mind that color meaning varies among cultures. So we think of black as a color, the color of mourning in the United States, but that is certainly not the universal color of mourning, as you can see here. Same with brides, same with royalty, and on and on and on. So be aware of your audience and who you're designing for, and use that knowledge, do a little research, and then use that when you're choosing colors. There's a lot of symbolism in color, especially associated with political and religious messages. So think about, you can even go online and think about, look at websites, and a political website may use a lot of red. A environmental website may use more greens. And then here we have an ad for Switzerland with a lot of white light that is meant to evoke divine illumination. And that is a very short look at color.